So you're looking for a large four-wheel drive to be family transport. Maybe you need to tow things, maybe you like going camping. Either way, a car-based SUV isn't going to do it. But you've also got a budget, 80 grand in particular. You cannot spend more than that. So do you go for the cheapest possible Toyota Prado, or do you go for a glitzier Chinese four-wheel drive like the GWM Tank 500 that I've got with me today? It's a pretty simple proposition. This GX is the best Prado you can get for 80 grand drive away. You can only get a base Prado here in Australia for that price these days. Haven't things gone up? But from China, you can have a GWM Tank 500 Ultra Turbo Petrol Hybrid with all of the fruit. So which one is actually best in the real world? I've been testing these vehicles for a couple of weeks in order to find out. I've been living with them in town, I've been doing touring on the highway and on difficult Australian B roads, done a bit of off-roading with these vehicles and crunched all the numbers on paper to let you know my verdict. You can comment below at any time in this video with your thoughts, and before we get started, hit subscribe and the notification bell. Chasing cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. With these two four-wheel drives being very similar in things like size and weight, why don't we start with one of the biggest differences, and that is the powertrain. So lifting the bonnet on this Prado GX, which is about 78 grand drive away, you'd have to find 85 grand drive away for the GXL, which is more popular than this vehicle, admittedly. But under the bonnet of every Aussie Prado is the same engine, a 2.8 litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder with a mild hybrid system, combined outputs of 150 kilowatts of power and 500 newton meters of torque. Factoring in the fact that this thing weighs 2.5 tons, it's not a ton of motivation. When we drive the Prado, you'll see that the diesel isn't as bad as it initially sounds, but it's certainly not breaking any new ground in terms of performance for this segment. More on that later, because it's time for us to drop the bonnet on the Prado and check out something rather different in the tank. And it isn't just the stylistic differences, although you can check yourself out in the exaggerated use of chrome on the Tank 500. And if you're eagle-eyed, you will notice we don't have the MY25.5 facelift, which is still rolling into dealers at the moment. But by all accounts, most of the rest of this vehicle is fit for this comparison. Now, let's go under the bonnet. Dual gas struts, certainly nice compared to the manual strut on the Prado. And you'll immediately notice just a little engine cover back there, and that's because the powertrain is just completely different to the Toyota. This is a 2-litre turbo petrol 4-cylinder engine paired with a hybrid system, and there's a lot of complexity here. It's a 3-in-1 motor drive unit, a 9-speed hybrid automatic transmission, about a 1.75 kilowatt hour battery to provide additional energy. Combined outputs are really high, 255 kilowatts of power, more than 600 newton meters of torque, and that's divided up between about 180 kilowatts and 380 newton meters for the petrol engine, and another circa 75 kilowatts and 270-ish newton meters from the electric motor. And at certain times they mesh together to give you that full output, but not all the time. And I'll explain what I mean by that and what that does to the performance of this vehicle when we take it for a drive. So what do those powertrains do to the fuel economy? That's another big difference between these vehicles. With the Prado being diesel only in Australia for now, it does get better fuel efficiency and it has more touring range, as you'd expect from this group. Now, we did a proper Bowser to Bowser fuel economy comparison. Me and Evan went out, did a big touring loop, which had about 30% town and about 70% highway and B road. That was our mix. The Prado did 8.3 litres per 100 kilometres Bowser to Bowser, which compares pretty well to its 7.6 litre per 100 kilometre claim. Now, in town, it gets about 11 litres per 100 kilometres, but still, because it has a 110 litre fuel tank, your range based on our Bowser to Bowser test would be in excess of 1300 Ks, which is nice. But you'll also notice there's another filler cap here, and the blue one is for AdBlue, which you're going to have to fill up about every 8,000 Ks. And in fact, my AdBlue light has just come on, just my luck today. That's not something you have to deal with in the petrol tank or even in the 300 series Land Cruiser either. But how much thirstier is it to go for the petrol hybrid option? Well, it is thirstier and the tank is smaller, making things less convenient. Now, we can at least release the filler cap from outside the car rather than from a toggle inside the Prado, and we find the filler cap for a petrol tank that can take 91, which is the cheapest here in Australia, GWM claims 8.5 litres per 100 kilometres of petrol consumption. On our Bowser to Bowser loop, we got 11.1, which is a 33% increase over the amount of diesel a Prado churns through. But of course, this is petrol. No AdBlue is nice. In town, I've been getting around 14 litres per 100 kilometres out of the Tank 500 because it doesn't seem to lean on its EV driving credentials too much in town unless you've got a very light throttle. But one interesting thing is the CO2 emissions of these vehicles. It might not be something that you care about, but it is something that Toyota and GWM have to care about because Australia now has legal limits on how much CO2 vehicles like this can produce. And if vehicles are in excess of it, there are penalties paid by the manufacturer every year. As it turns out, both of these vehicles produce about 200 grams per kilometre of CO2, which is actually below the limit for 2025. But in 2026, the limit decreases to 180, and then both of these vehicles would be in breach. So don't be surprised if you see the plug-in hybrid version of the Tank 500 come to Australia from China. Toyota doesn't seem to be in as luxurious a position. There is a turbo petrol hybrid available in America, which also produces around 200 grams of kilometre per CO2. We know the platform underneath the Prado can do plug-in hybrid, but we certainly haven't seen it developed by Toyota just yet.
Since we filmed this video, GWM confirmed the Tank 500 plug-in hybrid is on its way to Australia, likely to share its mechanical four-wheel drive hybrid system with the Canon Alpha Ute. Its emissions are around 60 grams per kilometre of CO2, future-proofing it easily underneath NVES limits.
First, a bit of housekeeping. One, why are the cars dirty? Because we've presented them to you as they've been tested. We haven't bothered cleaning up these four-wheel drives. Instead, they've been put through the thorough Chasing Cars comparison test. This is how they look after that. Two, why GX? Well, it's under the price cap, as I mentioned, but this is also a long-term test vehicle here at Chasing Cars, which doesn't mean I'm biased towards it, but it does mean that I've known it fairly well. However, I was also the guy that conducted the Tank 500's launch testing for Chasing Cars when it came out in Australia. So that's given me a good chance to look at the improvements to the GWM over time. Whereas, as we know, the 250 Series Prado is pretty much a new vehicle here in the Australian market. Now, if you've watched my comparison of the Prado to the 300 Series, you'll know that I was not a big fan of the 110 grand drive-away Prado Kakadu. Well, this GX is about $32,000 cheaper drive-away, which is a huge delta. Obviously, as a result, you are getting a more rough and ready interior, but there's actually a kind of chic realness to the Prado GX's cabin that I like, starting with the cloth seats. Now, cloth seats usually mean El Cheapo, but not here. You actually get a beautiful grain in the cloth. They feel like a premium item, and you know what? The front seats of the Prado, even though they're unheated and have manual adjustment, are really comfortable and supportive for long drives. And that is going to make a huge difference if you're keeping this car long term. Unfortunately, you reach out and touch a plastic steering wheel in the Prado GX, which for a car that's almost 80 grand drive away is just crazy. It's why most people will want to spend another $7,000 or so to go to the GXL 5-seat spec. You're getting a premium, not leather, but premium steering wheel. You're getting vinyl seats instead of cloth, heated and cooled seats, privacy glass, roof rails, and a digital rear view mirror. But that's about it. Otherwise, everything else you see here is shared between GX and GXL, including a 12.3-inch touchscreen with Toyota's new infotainment system that works extremely well. It's snappy and clear and not overcomplicated. You also get a 7-inch screen in front of you, way smaller than the GWM, but again, it's straightforward with easy control with these hard buttons on the retro-style steering wheel. The cabin tech just works. Climate, easy, physical buttons for fan and temperature, dual zone here up front, lots of physical buttons for the controls for the low range, locking center diff, drive modes, clear USB ports right here. Toyota hasn't cheaped out on the ergonomics of the interior of the Prado. It actually works well. Now, some of the fitment is a bit cheap and not 300 series grade. You know the Prado is the entry-level Land Cruiser, but on the whole, it's fairly comfortable, pretty well screwed together, and everything is where you would expect. That's the name of the game in the front seat of the Prado. The back seat is really unadorned compared to the GWM Tank 500, which is full of buttons and controls. Well, kids, if your dad or mum goes for a Prado GX, you're not having much to play with. And you know what? That's okay. You've got air vents, which are good and blow super cold Toyota air conditioning, USB-C ports, a 12-volt socket, plush, soft materials on the doors, big windows, good headroom, good legroom for someone 6 foot or 183 centimeters like me. Okay toe room, though not heaps of leg support. You do have to splay your legs a little bit to get comfortable in the Prado. Nor does the rear seat slide, but it does recline. Now, without a third row, you're not really having to worry about cramming people into the back because there's no legal way to put them there anyway. So you're looking at 5 seats in the GX, and as a 5-seater, it works just fine. Moving into the Tank 500 Ultra, which is thousands of dollars cheaper than a Prado GX drive away, you think you've hit the lottery. You know there is some kind of a catch. And of course, there are elements to the Tank 500 which are too good to be true. And that comes down to things like the polish on things you'll find in the cabin and the way the vehicle drives, which we'll explore later. On the face of it, the spec is intense. A 14.6-inch touchscreen, a 12-inch digital instrument cluster, power adjustment for the steering wheel, let alone the seats, which are heated and cooled and massaging. This wood up here is just like a Formica simulation. That's not to say it isn't nicer than the Prado. The finishes do feel more expensive, but they lack polish. The seats, for instance, well, they might have massaging, but they're just not as supportive for the back as the cloth ones that you have in the Prado. And I say that after doing the same long distance loop in both cars. I was more comfortable in the Toyota. The software is convoluted on this touchscreen. It has wireless Apple CarPlay, which is good, but there's no fixed bar on the screen to easily get out of CarPlay. Hitting the fan controls down here does boot you out of CarPlay, but then requires manipulation on the screen, and customizing vehicle settings requires digging through arcane menus that the Toyota manages to simplify. Likewise, the screen in front of the driver is much bigger than the one in the Toyota, but it's less easy to interact with and customize its panels, and it also looks quite underbaked in terms of its graphics. There are some finishes which are nice, a properly finished headliner and no body-colored paint exposed on the B-pillar like there is in the Toyota. But there's simply a steeper learning curve to the buttons and the systems you find in the Tank 500. Of course, you do learn it over time, but as you learn it, you come to realize that GWM needs to learn how to streamline its interfaces to make this car less random and easier to live with day to day. But while front seat comfort and technology, polish and UI sophistication has a way to go with the Tank 500, there's little work left to do in the back seat, which is better than the Prado. Firstly, it's on rails, so you can slide it, you can create extra room for the standard third row, you can max out space here in the second row, but there's also more toys. There's an additional climate zone back here, there's heating and cooling for the back seats too. God, kids are spoiled in the GWM. Additional USB ports, air vents, sun blinds, and the stadium seating also means a good view out, while the windows themselves are big too, with lots of facets like these roof-mounted vents seemingly inspired by the Toyota. Plus a flip-down armrest, which feels really solid, cup holders built in. In the battle of the back seats, the Tank 500 is the easy winner. Coming around the back of the Prado now, this is a real 80s retro revival exterior design. Frankly, I like it. I think the low-end specs look best. You want the Toyota written across the bonnet, which is GX, GXL, and Altitude. I would go that way. Now this GX is very unadorned, not even any roof rails. That's something you pick up on the GXL level. But we do get a cool feature on every Prado around the back, which is separately opening glass. So we can tap a little button there, open the glass, chuck stuff in without having to do the full door, which, unsurprisingly, on the GX is manual, not powered. You've got to start stepping up the range in the Prado to get those luxuries, but that wouldn't fit our budget. And with the door open, you immediately see a packaging compromise of the 48-volt system in the Toyota. Now, the boot height isn't that different to the Tank, but it would be lower if this vehicle didn't have its fairly superfluous hybrid system. That being said, the 5-seater Prados are way better than the 7-seaters. Here's some B-roll over the top of the 7-seat boot, which is a real mess. Check out how well the 7 seats of the Tank are packaged in a couple of minutes. But you've got more space ultimately in the Prado, just under 1,000 litres in 5-seat mode. Household power point, pretty big, pretty wide, pretty spacious boot. But on the GX, you'll be having to lift that boot and close it manually by yourself. Well, if the Prado is an 80s revival, the Tank 500 is a hardcore 90s revival, covered in silver trim and chrome and a spare tyre mounted on the back. it kind of looks like a 90 Series Prado from this angle, and I've noticed a few reviewers on YouTube have been a bit derogatory about that, but frankly, hey, the 90s were an amazing time for lots of people, and so you might still enjoy the way this vehicle looks, and that's completely fine. You know, one retro thing we have back here is a door that opens from a side hinge, so you need to be careful in car parks that you don't bang that into the wall, but it opens up to reveal a boot space that packages a third row as standard, and we can drop that with power control, which takes a while, be easier if it was just manual, but nice to have. And certainly the third row is better packaged in the Tank than it is in the Prado, because some variants give you a third row, and we'll show you that B-roll now. Now, once those are down, you are getting about 150 litres less space in the Tank 500 compared to the Prado, but it's still a big square. It's still relatively easy to pack your stuff in, though you will notice there is a raised floor here as well for the hybrid battery of this vehicle. Now, no power tailgate, of course, because of that side hinge, but it actually has soft close, so you can sort of fail to close it, and it will pull itself closed.
Before heading on-road, let's talk off-roading capability and what you can tow with these wagons. Both the Prado and Tank 500 are proper ladder frame vehicles with good articulation and reasonable ground clearance from factory, meaning they're capable of moderate trails like these ones, or a bit harder without modification. On our basic off-road test, we did notice the Tank 500's superior 224 mils of ground clearance meant we scraped its belly less than the Prado, which has 210 millimeters of clearance. Breakover angles are identical at 22 degrees, while the Prado's 31-degree approach angle is a little better than the Tank. The Toyota's quoted 17-degree departure angle looks poor, though the reality doesn't seem as bad. Perhaps it's accounting for the tow bar. If you know, please let me know. Meanwhile, the Tank 500 claims 24-degree departure. Both vehicles have mechanical four-wheel drive and dual-range transfer cases, plus a locking center differential. The Tank 500 Ultra goes much further with lockable front and rear diffs. On the Prado, only the pricey Altitude offers a locking rear differential. Frankly, both vehicles walked this test that involved light to medium difficulty off-roading, simulating what real buyers are likely to do with brand new metal. When it comes to towing, the Prado is rated for max 3,500 kilos braked, and the Tank 500 is limited to 3,000 kilos. The GWM's higher GVM of 3,395 kilos versus the Toyota's low 3,100 kilo GVM is what makes a difference to real-world usability. When towing 3 tons, assuming a 300 kilo tow bar download, the Tank 500 has 490 kilos payload remaining, while the same 3-ton trailer on the Toyota means the Prado's payload is capped at just 305 kilos, or 255 kilos with a 3.5-ton trailer hooked up.
Okay, let's start off the driving in the Prado. So, slotted into gear. We've got a familiar powertrain here, although a new transmission compared to the old Prado. But as I explained before, everything is different in the driving between these two vehicles. They might both be body-on-frame four-wheel drives with low range. That's a similarity. They're pretty much the same size, very similar weight, but what's under the bonnet really makes the character of them. So we've got the now venerable, I guess, 2.8 litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder from Toyota. Yes, it has the V-active 48 volt mild hybrid system, but you know, it's pretty mild. You're not feeling it when you drive in the vehicle. You're really only feeling it with the reduced boot capacity. And there have been markets overseas that got a non-48 volt new Prado. But of course, now with these emissions laws starting to bite in Australia, we're going to have to see more and more of these, I guess, creative solutions. But anyway, how does the Prado drive? Well, I'll come back to powertrain because the other big difference is actually how it handles. And even though these vehicles are very similar in size, the Prado oddly feels much more direct and feelsome. And I don't think anyone's ever used words like that to describe the Toyota Prado. It took a comparison with the Tank 500 to bring out that relative strength. But in all seriousness, and not to damn Toyota with faint praise, they've actually done pretty good work on the 250 Series Prado to make it a better driving vehicle. Compared to the old Prado, body roll is more contained, grip is better, the handling is more secure, and in particular, the steering is considerably better. It's more immediate off-center, it's more feelsome, and the ratio is actually really good. It's really intuitive, you know exactly where it's going, and it just feels connected to the road. Unusual qualities for a body-on-frame Land Cruiser, but here they are. If only they were backed up by a slightly better ride quality. It's that classic four-wheel drive where you feel the road imperfections, even on these relatively small alloys. And ultimately, the Tank 500 is a little bit more plush in terms of ride, but there's not that much in it. If only the good handling of the Prado was backed up by a slightly more desirable engine. Frankly, the diesel is fine. It actually gets the job done, but it's noisy. Listen to that, no hybrid system, not a petrol, so of course it is much louder in the cabin. Now, we may eventually see a turbo petrol Prado here in Australia, though it has similar CO2 emissions, so it's not going to be kind of the perfect solution for Toyota Australia to its coming problems with Land Cruisers. But the diesel is supplemented by an improved 8-speed torque converter automatic, which shifts quite quickly and quite aggressively to keep you in that 500 Newton meter peak torque band. So while it is slower to accelerate from 0 to 100 than the Tank 500, there's not as much in it than you might expect. And there's also a bit of an issue with the Tank 500's acceleration that will come to. Otherwise, things like visibility out of the Prado are really excellent, with this very square sort of fishbowl kind of thing going on with its shape. And the other major difference is actually the tuning of the safety features. Now, the Prado's got a very generous suite, just like the Tank. It's got things like strong lane centering, which is nice on long drives because it reduces your fatigue, adaptive cruise control, driver monitoring, the whole lot. The thing is, not only is the sensitivity lower in the Toyota, but the tuning is much more sophisticated. The lane keep does not bother you as you get down the road in this vehicle. It merely supplements your driving when you want it. The attention monitoring is less sensitive. Toyota has simply turned that down for the Australian market, allowing you to do things like head checks without getting pinged by the car for failing to concentrate, which is a major issue in the GWM, although one that is being worked on. You can tell Toyota R&D simply put more time into getting these important safety features right, so that they become something that you want to use rather than something that you want to turn off. That's a big difference. Okay, we've jumped into the Tank 500, and if I am very gentle on the throttle, I can in fact pull away in complete silence, but the engine's already kicked in. And that's because while this is a hybrid, it is a very heavy one. And the electric motor itself is not that strong. It's sort of under 80 kilowatts of power, around 260 Newton meters. So you're talking kind of like a Volkswagen Polo, Volkswagen Golf amount of go in a vehicle that weighs 2,600 kilos. So it's not surprising that even though the Tank 500's a hybrid, it needs to use its 2-litre turbo petrol 4-cylinder engine a lot of the time. And that's one of the reasons why the fuel consumption ultimately isn't that impressive. But is the petrol hybrid system itself impressive? Well, the answer is sometimes. And that's because one of the Tank's biggest problems that needs improvement is the software behind its power unit. And that's something that doesn't get spoken about enough with hybrid systems. Probably because with hybrids, all we knew for years was Toyota, which had relatively straightforward hybrids, not the most refined, but they just kind of worked. And there's actually a big discrepancy starting to open up in how smooth and effective the software tuning of various hybrids on the market are. Now, when you catch the Tank 500 at a moment where everything comes together and works perfectly, this hybrid system is brilliant and way ahead of the Prado's diesel in terms of refinement. Take off on a moderate throttle or go to accelerate out of a corner on a country road, and occasionally the response will be just lush and delicious. You'll get some torque from the petrol engine, 380 Newton meters or so. You'll feel the electric torque blending in seamlessly, taking you out to those big combined outputs. The whole thing feels muscular and girthy and powerful. But unfortunately, some of the rest of the time, you'll go to accelerate in the Tank 500 and you'll get a response which is very different. It might be that the small battery that supports the hybrid system is depleted, so all of a sudden you're relying only on the petrol engine's outputs, which again are pretty modest for such a large and heavy vehicle, and it requires a big old rev, and that's when you hear the engine. The problem is that the system thinks about it for several seconds before you take off. Like right now we get the power. Coming out of that corner, I was pretty much flat into the pedal for 2 to 3 seconds, and the system really has a good old think about, do I have hybrid power? What gear do I want to be in? Has the turbo come on boost? When all of those things are sorted out, you finally get forward motion. Now, we did 0 to 100 testing on these cars. The answer reveals what I'm talking about. When it's got charge in the battery, it can be really quick, way ahead of the Prado. But as the battery depletes, the Tank 500's acceleration actually ends up being slower than the Prado. And because you can't charge it manually, you just never know what you're gonna get. That's something GWM should work on, because when the hybrid system is engaged and working properly, it's brilliant. But the rest of the time, it's a bit confusing. But what about the ride and handling? Well, it feels a generation behind the Prado. In fact, it feels quite a lot like the old Prado, which wasn't that bad to drive. It just had lower limits than the new one. The steering is pretty loose in the Tank 500. The ratio in the steering is pretty slow, so you've got to turn the wheel more than you have to in the Prado to achieve the same thing. The thin rimmed wheel does feel decent in the hand, and grip levels from the Giddy tires are, they're not too bad, and off-road we were able to get done what we needed to get done, so the tires seem all right. The ride quality is reasonably supple. I think at times it's actually better than the ride you get in the Toyota, but you're certainly hearing a lot of flex through the body of the Tank 500. Doesn't feel particularly rigid. You can kind of hear the rear seats moving as you cross bumps on country roads at 80 or 100 kilometers per hour. The whole experience feels pretty isolating, pretty disconnected, but also quite plush, and I think that's something a lot of people will like. One of the big problems though is the sensitivity of the safety features, and this is something GWM Australia in particular has been working on over time. The lane keeping assist is utterly oversensitive, and I have had to turn it off every single time, which requires multiple taps through the touchscreen. Once you do that, you're not being bombarded with corrections and warnings constantly. The other one is the driver attention monitoring. Now, this is no longer really an issue because you can turn it off permanently if you go and get a software update released a few days ago. But in its current form, it's just constantly saying, concentrate while driving. It's like, I'm literally looking forward right now. But again, at least GWM is working on it. So that brings us to the need for a verdict. And I'll be honest with you, this is one of the hardest comparisons that I've had to judge over the last few years. And that's because these vehicles just do different things well. Clearly, the Tank 500 brings enormous bang for buck. You're getting so many features for less than the price of a base model Prado, and that cannot be understated. It also is trying to innovate with its turbo petrol powertrain, which occasionally does things well, and its driving dynamics aren't too bad. However, the polish of its powertrain control unit is severely lacking, and half the time you just don't know what the engine is trying to do. It probably uses a bit too much fuel, it doesn't have a massive tank, and so its range is quite limited. And then there's the various safety features, which are horrendously oversensitive, though I acknowledge GWM is improving this over time, and the new update will allow you to turn off the attention monitor permanently, which is good. By contrast, the Toyota's diesel engine feels distinctly old school, but its power delivery is consistent, its transmission tuning is good, and it just does what you expect. Its steering and handling and ride are all slightly better in terms of this vehicle feeling fluent and intuitive on a country road. Toyota's clearly worked on the Prado's driving dynamics, which is good. It can tow more, but its payload is not as useful as the Tank 500, so it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But then there's the fact that the Prado's cabin, while clearly significantly more Spartan, has technology that just works and very well calibrated safety features that you actually want to use because they make your life easier and less fatiguing, and they're not constantly annoying you. So that means the answer is this. The Prado continues to be the better car when judged by things that vehicles need to do, driving in a polished and fluent way and not frustrating you as you do it. But I openly acknowledge the Tank 500's value proposition is excellent, but the GWM needs more polish before it will be able to overwhelm the Prado's 20-to-1 sales advantage. So in this comparison, as crazy as it might seem for a base Prado to beat a Tank 500 with all those toys, the Toyota is the winner. Now I want to be clear, no one paid me. Neither Toyota or GWM offered to put cash in my pocket, and I wouldn't have accepted it ever, even if they did. Chasing Cars is about honest, independent road testing, powered by Budget Direct. That's the difference you get on this channel. Click subscribe down below if you want to see more of our honest reviews. Hit the notification bell to get notified every time we make an upload. Leave us a comment, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.